the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast episode 148. My name is user SteelCan909, and today we are going to be talking in the first part of our two-part video on the Opium Wars. We are going to cover today the build-up to the First Opium War. I'm joined by user Enclaved Microstate.
Yes, hello, Enclave Microstate here, other side of the mic this episode. So I'm here to talk about the Opium Wars. I was flared in it for about 6 months until I broadened out to the later Qing dynasty more broadly. The phrase Opium Wars refers to two armed conflicts that occurred in mid-19th century China. These are known as the First and Second Opium War. The First War was fought between Britain and China between the years 1839 and 1842. It's sometimes just known as the Opium War or the First Anglo-China War. The Second War, which is also known as the Arrow War, was fought from October 1856 to 1860, and this time Britain was allied with France. These are, at least traditionally in the popular memory, thought of as, in some ways, sort of China's rude awakening, the moment in which the Western powers forcibly opened China to trade and exposed it to the full might of Western industrial technology. In sort of Maoist and post-Maoist construction, this is known as the commencement of a period called the Century of Humiliation. Irrespective of the extent to which these were contemporary opinions to the wars themselves and the extent to which they're actually justifiable in light of historical evidence, nevertheless, the Opium Wars still hold an immense symbolic power. And so that means that in some ways they are still incredibly relevant down to this day. Speaking of my own primary school education in Hong Kong, you kind of have to mention the Opium Wars when we talk about how Hong Kong came about.
So you've given us the brief overview. Let's go ahead and dive right in. What the more specific, the background as to what's going on, because as we all know here as historians, things that happen in a period of history, they never just happened in isolation. There's always a broader context. There's a history behind history, so to speak. So go ahead and walk us through what is the background to all of this.
So, if you're going to talk about the background to the Opium Wars, one thing you really need to understand is how do the early modern or late imperial, depending on your perspective, Chinese states view trade. And these were the Ming and the Qing dynasties that ruled from 1368 to 1644 and then from 1644 to 1912, respectively. The thing about trade in these periods is it's never just about money, and it isn't just about merchants. The key thing about trade is that it is also an incredibly powerful diplomatic and to some extent military tool. The Ming and Qing dynasties both actively used trade as a means of effectively controlling frontier powers and essentially by providing an economic lifeline, dissuading them from engaging in hostile military action. The Qing were, in fact, very early on the subjects of this policy. The Ming had established a patent system in Manchuria. What the patent system means is that basically the Ming would create these documents that, in English at least, are known as patents, which entitled whoever held them to bring a certain number of followers with a certain amount of goods with him when he went on a tribute mission to Beijing. This was not to be exchanged for goods in Beijing necessarily. The basic idea was that these goods would be sold at markets in northern China, which makes these missions a sort of massive artificial economic stimulus by letting chieftains have direct access to Chinese markets for their goods, which might not otherwise have existed. Now, this system evidently worked for a while at preventing the Jurchen tribes in Manchuria from uniting, but eventually they do unite under Nurhaci, and it seems that the main thing that changed was that there was a much more active private commercial network in the region that made the old trade arrangement less useful. And in fact, at one point, Nurhaci just stopped engaging in patent trade at all. And this is years before he even decides to declare war on the Ming. But the Qing do pick up on this lesson that you can, as long as you make sure that the deal updates itself regularly, use trade to control foreign enemies. And this is quite readily apparent in the Qing's first major diplomatic relations with the West, which was with the growing Russian Empire. In 1689, the Qing signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia, which, on the one hand, everyone remembers that the Qing get more territory in Siberia, but the key provision is that the Russians are allowed to trade furs at the city of Kyakhta, and in exchange can buy things like tea, silk, porcelain, and even just get some silver back. And this produces an economic incentive for the Russians not to continue feuding with the Qing in Siberia, or, crucially, supporting the Dzungar Khanate in western Mongolia that was vying with the Qing for control of the steppes. The key thing to note through all of this, however, is that just because the Qing are doing things that are similar to the Ming doesn't mean they're the same. And the fact that the Qing are interested in the steppe regions like Mongolia is, I think, one of the big things. The Qing are a multipolar, multi-ethnic empire with very different priorities in different regions. So one of the big things is that the Qing don't have a single capital. The capital is effectively wherever the emperor decides to be, which, under normal circumstances, is one of three places. There's the city of Beijing, which is the capital for China, the city of Mukden, now known as by its Mandarin name of Shenyang, which is the capital for Manchuria, and the city of Chengde, also sometimes known as Jehol, which was basically the administrative capital for Mongolia. And, of course, when the emperor was on campaign or out hunting, the court moved there. And obviously, this is a story for another time, but basically, this means that the Qing Empire is an incredibly complex entity, and it's why I don't normally call it China. The other big thing is that the Qing dynasty is often erroneously seen as isolationist. In fact, it is incredibly connected to the wider world. For one, as we're about to discuss, maritime trade, over which the Opium War was fought, had been ongoing for over a century by the time that war broke out with Britain, and that brought huge amounts of goods into China, and of course tea, silk, and porcelain was going out. And at the same time, there were sort of diplomatic and intellectual links due to the Qing having a large number of Jesuit courtiers who brought incredibly specialized skills in things like astronomy and mathematics and surveying. So, for example, the Kangxi Emperor commissioned an atlas of the empire that was completed in 1721, when sort of the famous French cartographer Cassini was only 7 years old. The Qing were, in some ways, at the forefront of a lot of, in some ways, early modern technological innovation, even if they weren't the innovators directly, but they were very eager to use them.
Going back to an earlier point that you raised, one of our common understandings of China at this time is that it was an isolationist power that was resisting being opened up to trade with the Western world. And you mentioned that the Qing are emphatically not isolationist. They have a global connection, drawing in, trade around their local part of the world, and broader influences from the rest of the world. How much of this is a continuity from the Ming, and how much of this is a newfound to the Qing state?
Part of the complexity is that the Ming had also been somewhat resistant in early years to, well, I say also, the Ming had been particularly resistant to the forcible opening of trade, mostly by Portugal and the Netherlands. And so trade with the Ming from Europe was somewhat less in volume than it would be under the early Qing. There are a few features of the late Ming arrangement that survive under the Qing. The big one is Macau. The Portuguese had occupied the peninsula and neighbouring island that make up Macau and had demanded, effectively, to be allowed to keep it. Eventually, a deal was hammered out whereby Portugal leased the land from the Ming. But the big advantage of having Macau was that it provided a harbour for Portuguese ships who would then go up to trade at Canton, which at a time when the trading rhythms hadn't really been fully sorted out, offered a degree of stability. It has to be noted that there was a period of major discontinuity from 1650s to 1683 because the Qing were worried about Ming pirates on Taiwan who had been resisting against the Qing even after most of China had been overrun. And one policy had been that basically the entire coastline was to be evacuated. So until the 1680s, there was no maritime trade because no one was supposed to be living on the coast anymore. When trade resumes, it is of a much larger volume, not least because there are more countries involved. Britain and France, especially, are ranging significantly further into Asia, and of course, Portugal and the Netherlands are redoubling their own efforts. The thing really that has to be noted is that the volume of trade is quite high. By 1805, by 1807 rather, on average 240,000 pickles of tea, a pickle is about 60 kilograms, were being exported through Canton every year, and this was only a relatively marginal increase from where it was in 1700. All throughout this period, there is a gradual movement towards greater and greater amounts of trade, and during the early Qing period, in fact, there's a relatively laissez-faire attitude towards how this trade is being conducted. Part of it is simply that Canton is such a convenient port that virtually none of the others are used, and what ends up happening in Canton is that the Chinese officials, the Chinese merchants, and the foreign merchants are all basically trying to work to maximize the amount of trade. The reason the customs officials are so interested in increasing this trade is a little quirk of the Qing system where customs officials were entitled to a small cut of the duties they collected. So it was in their interest to maximize the amount of goods that were being processed by customs, and so that meant more trade. But obviously, the customs officials couldn't raise tariffs too high because that would disincentivize more trading. So it's a negotiated process where measures sort of come and go in order to suit the situation. So by 1704, this is about 2 decades into the trade, fees are properly regularized. There is no longer the worry, basically, that duties will increase significantly from one year to the next. In the 1720s, there's an especially interesting arrangement known as security merchants. Basically, Chinese merchant houses would provide guarantees for particular companies, so like the East India Company of various countries, obviously, there was more than just one. And these would provide stable arrangements where the European partner would get a certain amount of extra crew. They would get, sorry, not crew, dock workers. They would get crates as well. That's quite an important thing. And crucially, the Chinese merchants would guarantee their behavior in exchange for being the ones to directly collect the customs revenues. And the Chinese merchants' other benefit was that they got an exclusive share of the cargo on those British or French or Dutch or, in some cases, Indian ships that were coming in. More arrangements are made by 1731. The Qing are officially licensing translators and also agents known as compradors. There's also a bit of tension, of course, because basically trade isn't happening year-round and you don't want people staying in Canton year-round. So from 1741 onwards, foreigners are required to vacate Canton for 2 months of the year from May to July. Sorry, 3 months from May to July, basically because you don't want a load of out-of-work merchants hanging around your major trading port. But obviously, this isn't a system that can last forever. The thing about the ad hoc arrangement is it works while it works, but by the middle of the 1750s, there's this sense by some British merchants that there's more potential in going to other ports as well. So under the leadership of James Flint, who was one of the major East India Company merchants, ships tried to trade at the port of Ningbo, significantly further up the coast, from 1755 to 1757. In response to this, the Tianlong Emperor orders that the the port of Ningbo is to be closed to foreign trade, and in fact, all the ports are to be closed to foreign trade apart from Canton. Um, if an exception is made for Japan, which is allowed to trade at Ningbo simply because it's closer. This is a decision that is often seen as the Qing are suddenly clamping down on trade, but in many ways, fundamentally, all that the Tianlong Emperor is doing is affirming an existing arrangement whereby all these structures that are in place in Canton, continue to be used, and he just is trying to avoid the complexity of trying to create an imperial scale customs system where European ships might turn up completely unexpectedly at different ports without regularized arrangements. But also, there's an imperial perspective to this, which is that the Qing in 1757 are reaching the apex of their power. Earlier in the year, the last of the major Mongol rebels, a guy called Chingunjev, is defeated and killed. And later in the year, the Dzungar client prince Amosana, who tries to rebel against the Qing, is also expelled, and he dies in exile the next year. Shortly after that, the Qing conquer Turkestan, which completes basically the entire program of imperial conquest. And in one sense, you can see the establishment of the Canton system in a formal sense by restricting all foreign trade to that one port as being very much part of a pattern where the Qing are also securing their land frontier in Inner Asia. And what's particularly interesting under the early Canton system is that links with Inner Asia are quite strong. The Qing would very frequently, and by very frequently I mean 3 times, embargo Russia for perceived diplomatic slights. And whenever they did that, one of the key goods that they were exporting to Russia, which was rhubarb, would also be banned in Canton so that the Russians wouldn't get it by sea. So I think another important aspect here to note quite early on is that when we talk about Qing policy on the coast, we also have to see it in line with its policy inland, because the Qing, despite their very pluralistic policy for administering the empire, also have quite a consistent policy direction when it comes to that empire's frontiers.
So up until now, we've been getting to the year 1757. You've mentioned that we're coming to the apex of Qing power. What changes in 1757? Why is that a turning point?
1757 isn't necessarily a turning point per se. I think you might call it the beginning of a bit of a plateau, because by 1759, the Qing state is evidently still strong enough that when James Flint, the guy who goes to Ningbo, tries to petition A, to get the Canton Customs Commissioner removed for corruption, and B, to formally open Ningbo, Flint is successful in getting the Canton Commissioner removed, but he's thrown in prison for 3 years for improperly petitioning the emperor. And the East India Company doesn't even pay the ransom that the Qing offer. So the Qing are clearly able to leverage quite a bit of prestige even going into the 1760s. The big things that start going wrong really start around the 1790s. The first major issue is the White Lotus Rebellion. This is something that breaks out in the interior of China. I mean, dates vary on when it properly starts, between 1794 and 1796. But when it properly breaks out in 1796, the Qing Empire has a treasury surplus of about 100 million taels of silver. A tael is commonly translated as a Chinese ounce, and I think that basically gets the weight across. When the Tianlong Emperor died 3 years later, that entire treasury surplus was basically gone. And he leaves his son, the Qing Emperor, with an immense crisis of unparalleled scale. The problem is that the Qing army is incapable of dealing with the rebels, and the mercenaries they're hiring are sacking the very villages that they're supposed to be protecting. And the Qing Emperor has a hell of a time trying to not just actually fight the rebels, but also raise the funds necessary to continue doing so. His only lucky break, really, is that he investigates the Tianlong Emperor's old favourite He Shun for corruption, and basically is able to seize all the assets that he had illegally laundered during his time in various official positions. But He Shun is really the only major, you might call it, symptom of the late Tianlong crisis that really properly gets dealt with under the Jiaqing reign. While there are attempts by certain groups like the Xuannan Club to try and re-centralize imperial power, the Jiaqing reign is characterized largely by an imminent problem of decentralization. What compounds all of this is the Eight Trigrams Rebellion of 1813, where a group of rebels conspired with palace eunuchs to attempt to assassinate the emperor, and he only got away because he was out hunting that day. But to have such a high-level threat to the emperor turn up, where these strange Buddhist sectarians have conspired with palace eunuchs, clearly must have also shaken the confidence of the Qing state somewhat. When the Jiaqing emperor dies in 1820, he leaves his son, the Daoguang emperor, also with a growing economic crisis. The causes of this crisis are still somewhat debated. The current proposal by Richard von Glan is that it was a mixture of currency debasement leading to a huge amount of over-minting of copper currency, plus the introduction of paper money at a time when the amount of base metal coinage and the amount of silver was not really increasing substantially. And the effect of this is that the value of copper coinage depreciated massively. In 1805, one tael of silver was worth 950 copper coins. By the time the Opium War began in 1839, one silver tael was worth 1,679 copper coins. So this produces obvious problems if, for example, you're a freeholding peasant who's earning most of his income in copper coins, but your taxes are being assessed in silver. Even though the silver value of your taxes will be the same from year to year, the actual cost to you of paying those taxes is going up. And a further effect of the economic depression, which was also brought on in part by a huge increase in population, the empire's population doubled roughly between 1700 and 1800, was that you have a lot of people and a lot less land per person. And quite a lot of these people who might have been freeholding farmers before are moving into alternative professions like weaving. And so what had been a relatively economically specialized system where certain regions, especially Jiangnan, were producing a large number of goods like textiles and pottery, was starting to collapse as you have these regional cottage industries that are outcompeting the more expensive, higher quality goods coming from the previously dominant specialized regions. So in all, the Qing state as a whole is in a very bad spot in the 1830s, economically for one and politically for another. And then there's the issue of the canton system in particular, which is reasonable in 1757 if it's affirming an existing system. But the canton system, just like the patent system in Manchuria, started to be faced with challenges it wasn't designed to. So the first was a perceived limitation in the amount of potential growth. Between 1804 and 1831, the customs revenues coming out of Canton did not increase at all, which suggests that basically the amount of trade wasn't expanding. So this was bad for the Chinese merchants and it was bad for the customs officials. The other problem was that there was, as part of the Canton system, an official Chinese monopoly on trade. The Qing officials had originally had a system where you had to pay for a license. As a result of the decisions in 1857, eventually the security merchants just formed a single unit known as the Kohong that controlled all trade with the foreigners, and increasingly Western merchants who were less and less affiliated with major companies like the East India companies and more being private firms, basically chafed at the problem of having to deal mostly with this singular monopoly. And these country traders, which was the name given to non-East India Company merchants, also were less willing to respect local customs. As we noted before, there was this case of James Flint, whose bail wasn't even paid by the East India Company that he was a part of. The country traders at one point eagerly flouted Chinese regulations. Officially, for example, you weren't supposed to bring the they weren't supposed to bring their wives to the Canton factory quarter because it was supposed to be men only. They did it several times, and wars could have started over the fallout from those incidents. The country traders also, being merchants, have an especially big interest in maximizing their profits, and increasingly it was becoming profitable to have silver on hand when you went to Canton, instead of just bringing your own goods, selling those, and then getting tea and silk and porcelain off the silver you earned from selling your goods. So what they would do was start to work in trading contraband. So they would basically sell goods in small quantities at ports other than Canton, get silver out of that, and then arrive at Canton with that silver. And the problem was Qing regulations made that especially bad because there were premiums you had to pay on silver. So when you sold stuff, you had to pay a premium on the silver you were getting out of it, and then you had to pay another premium to be allowed to use that silver to buy goods. So basically, it was a system that incentivized the growth of smuggling. And what do they smuggle except opium? Opium was the big thing that obviously gives its name to the war, and opium trading begins on a very small scale, mostly medicinal opium, around the beginning of the 18th century. It becomes more regular from the late 18th century onwards, and between about 1780 and 1820, there's a relatively steady rate of about 4,000 to 5,000 chests of opium a year. A chest is about 63 kilograms. By 1838, however, the amount of opium being smuggled in has shot up to 34,000 chests a year. The causes of this are mostly, really, that the East India Company completely mishandled its opium growing. Originally, the East India Company had a monopoly over opium growing in India, and therefore it could artificially inflate prices, so you could export the same amount of opium but get more and more money out of it. The trouble was the East India Company didn't actually control all of India, and so when the independent Indian state of Malwa decided to start competing with the East India Company, basically the company had no choice, if it was to retain its profits, that is, but to keep producing more and more opium. As far as how many people would have been consuming opium at this point in China, estimates will range anywhere from 300,000 to 4 million, out of a total population of about 400 million. So the extent to which we're talking about a national drug crisis is contingent upon basically which figures you're going for and how willing you are to accept the somewhat alarmist opinions of some Qing magistrates, as opposed to the obviously self-aggrandizing tendencies of British merchants.
So, the first question that I have about this: why was the East India Company interested in opium to begin with, and how did it end up in China? You mentioned that they were growing too much of it to maintain their own monopoly. Why were they investing in this business to begin with?
So the East India Company's main motive, really, for producing more opium was that a good was needed to counterbalance the massive amount of tea that Britain was importing from China rather. The thing about the East India Company up until 1831 was that it held an exclusive monopoly on trade between Britain and China and between Britain and India. The country traders that came out of the legal loophole emerging from the fact that the East India Company didn't have a monopoly on trade between China and India. The reason that opium was grown was simply that it was potentially immensely profitable. Opium had been introduced to China since the 9th century at least as a medicinal herb, but its major use as a recreational drug came about beginning in the mid-17th century when it started to be used as an additive to tobacco. So uh, the indications we get of the very early opium trade in the early 18th century was this recognition that opium was a potentially highly valuable good. Intensive growing in the later part of the 18th century comes really out of the East India Company gaining more control of India after the after the 7 Years' War, and also simply the huge volume of tea that was being imported. As for how the opium gets to China, the East India Company had basically a very sneaky way of doing it. It used the country traders. Officially, the East India Company did not export any opium to China. The East India Company merchants in China, who, just to add a special nuance to this here, the Canton merchants of the East India Company were basically in Canton for their entire professional career, more or less. They were with the East India Company, but this was a special assignment that pretty much only they went on, and they wouldn't go on any others. These Canton merchants could claim, in all seriousness, to not see a chest of opium in the time they were there, because what the East India Company would do was that they would auction off the opium in places like Kolkata to the country traders, and the country traders are the ones who take it to China. The country traders aren't exclusively British, is the interesting thing. In fact, quite a lot of them are Indian themselves, of which a significant portion were Parsis, that is, the Zoroastrian community in India. So, alongside the big firms like Jardine Matheson and Dent, were traders like the Rustomjis and the Gigi boys. In fact, one of the major purchasing agents for Jardine and Matheson was Jamsetji Jijiboy, who was also one of the major Parsi merchants.
Interesting. So here we are. Opium is coming into China. What is the next step? How do we go from unregulated or a large amount of smuggling in drugs to two imperial powers duking it out over the drug trade?
I think one point to note here is that part of the reason we're especially, if you take a contingent approach to the Opium War, opium may just be the one thing that just happens to push everything over the edge in 1839. In many ways, it's not the sole cause, because throughout the period, British and Chinese diplomacy is occasionally quite fractious. There are two infamous embassies, one somewhat more infamous than the other, and this is the Mccartney Embassy of 1793, in which Lord Mccartney goes to China expecting to petition the emperor to reopen trade at ports like Ningbo, and also, for whatever reason, cede an island off the coast of Ningbo just to make it easier for Britain to trade there. Mccartney does not get a very good reception as far as these terms are concerned. It's also the origin of the Tianlong Emperor's proclamation that the Qing Empire didn't need anything from anywhere else, which was, I think, basically it's pretty clear, an untruth. The Tianlong Emperor was trying to make himself make himself look better in front of foreign powers, which is something he did quite often. But one product of Macartney's embassy was an incredibly jaded view of China, and he became convinced that China's foreign Manchu rulers were secretly hated, and that basically, if a British squadron of frigates turned up and started blasting away at the coast, that could start a chain reaction that would lead to a huge revolt in China, and the Chinese people, who were presumably far more receptive to foreign trade, would be more receptive to foreign trade and give Britain the concessions they wanted. The later mission of Amherst in 1816 is less interesting. All that really happens is that Amherst basically gets in a fight in the receiving chamber, doesn't even get an audience with the emperor, and returns to Britain disappointed. And what this basically highlights is that Britain and China are not really reaching any kind of diplomatic consensus, because beyond the very simple one of please stop sending us embassies because they always go badly. So when push starts coming to shove in the early 19th century in Canton, there is no formal diplomatic channel. So that's part of why it ends up going so badly, because there is no way to defuse tensions in the provinces, because there is no formal embassy.
So before we move on into the war itself, I just want to get a small clarification, and maybe you can elaborate on it a little bit. One thing that I've noticed is that you've called the Chinese emperors by a specific name. I'm not going to try and pronounce them, but But I'm just wondering, could you speak a little bit? What is, and this actually ties back into the Manchu versus Chinese aspect that you got at with one of the embassies. How is the Qing, or what is the Qing's guiding ideology? How is it different than, I mean, in terms of how it conceives itself, how it looks at China, or how does it see the emperorship? How is it different from what we're familiar with, both as a predominantly Western audience and what we might be more familiar with in a Chinese context, such as the Ming or earlier dynasties?
I think the first simple statement to say is that for the Qing, China is not the core of the empire, it is a part of the empire. We tend to conceive of China, even today, as being basically this core bit surrounded by additional holdings. The Qing, because they originate in Manchuria and maintain a ruling caste drawn in large part from that region, don't have the same view of things. They see China as a significant component of their empire. It is certainly the richest, and it's the one that fuels their imperial conquests. But it is nevertheless only one part of it. And the Qing always have an eye to issues in Mongolia and Tibet and Manchuria and Turkestan that also occupy its attention. So I think that's the major highlight. The Qing don't see their empire as China with agglomerations. They see their empire almost like a sort of federal state, but with the representative of all of these entities being the single person of the emperor. And this single person of the emperor is not simply, the Confucian sage king that the Ming would have expected of their emperors. He is simultaneously a sort of Confucian sage king and the great Khan of the Mongols and a Manchu warlord and a Buddhist sort of wheel-turning avatar of heaven's will. So it's a situation in which there are a huge number of forces ongoing, and all the different parts of the empire are looking to the emperor as the sort of single guiding figure holding it all together. There are different approaches by different emperors, but from the Qianlong reign onwards, the basic idea is that the emperor is, to quote Pamela Crossley, culturally null. The idea is that the emperor is, whatever the emperor does will be interpreted in a different way by each different section of the empire. And that's fine, as long as it's always interpreted as the emperor is doing these things with our interests in mind.
All right. So we mentioned so Britain and China have no diplomatic recourse in order to resolve disputes. There's large amounts of friction coming between these two powers over trading rights, over sale of opium, over all these other issues that you've mentioned. So let's go ahead, dive into it. What is the next step?
So there are obviously long, medium, short-term factors, etc. We've talked a bit about the long term. Really, for the medium term, the 1830s see huge changes on both sides. For the Qing, they start running up a trade deficit. Between 1826 and 1840, the Qing run up a trade deficit of about 61 million silver dollars. Because there's a lot of currency conversion going on, I know. The ratio is roughly, if I remember correctly, $3 to 2 taels. While this is a significant trade deficit, it has to be noted that this was only about 6.7% of the circulating silver in China, at most, possibly as low as 3.5%. So, while one effect of the economic crisis is a growing trade deficit, it's not necessarily one that is fatal to the Qing. It is still there, though. An interesting odd side effect of the economic crisis is actually a significant upshoot in the amount of tea and silk being exported. In the period 1807 to 13, on average, the Qing are exporting 240,000 pickles of tea. By 1828 to 35, this has gone up to 360,000 pickles a year. In the same period, silk goes from 20,000 pickles to 60,000 pickles a year. So what this is doing is it is further incentivizing greater smuggling of opium in order to buy all these additional goods that are being put on the table by the Chinese merchants. The problems for the Qing are being exacerbated by droughts in the Yangtze region, which go on for the first 5 years of the 1830s. And in response to all of these crises, you get the emergence of one major political faction in Beijing, known as the Spring Purification Circle. This largely recruits from young scholars in Beijing, and it's focused on primarily the idea of the politics of censure, that anyone should be allowed to criticize the behavior of anyone else in the government, because it believed fundamentally that the state had the ultimate authority to enforce morality in the empire. Rather logically, this means it's very opposed to opium, and when a group of officials who had served stints in the Guangdong provincial administration and therefore had experience dealing with foreigners in Canton proposed legalizing opium as a means of raising more taxes in 1836, the Spring Purification Circle sabotaged this attempt by revealing that a large number of merchants in Canton, including Hao Kwa, possibly the richest man in the world, had close links with opium distribution networks. There's also a frontier problem. In the 1820s, a sect of Sufism in the region of Turkestan known as Altishah became particularly prominent. It was known as the Afakir sect. The Afakir sect were opposed to continued Qing rule, and their leader, Jahangir Khwaja, with support from the neighbouring Khanate of Kokand, started trying to raise rebellion in the region, and this goes on from 1822 to 1828. After Jahangir is captured and executed, the Qing military commissioner in the region, Nayan Cheng, who is crucially Manchu because the regional administration in Turkestan was always held by members of the Eight Banner caste, which was mostly Manchu. Nayan Cheng embargoes the Khanate of Kokand, and in response, the Khanate of Kokand begins launching raids into Turkestan, and the Qing are forced to make a deal with the Khanate of Kokand in which they give up their tariff autonomy and allow the Kokandis to post officials in the region who are responsible for all legal proceedings involving foreigners. So, rather interestingly, when the Qing make this deal in 1832, they are giving away a lot of the concessions that they will later give the British because they are faced with a military crisis that they're not able to deal with. And they resort to giving away trade concessions as a sort of economic disincentive to further hostile action. On the British side of things, as noted, the country traders like to stir up trouble, and there are a huge number of incidents, either two significant ones. The first one in 1809 actually isn't to do with the country traders, it's to do with the British government, which tries to occupy Macau to protect it from potential attacks by the French. This does not go over well, and the Canton governor threatens an embargo, and the British abandon the occupation. In 1831, an altercation begins over the fact that the company merchants had reclaimed some land in front of the warehouse quarter and planted a shrubbery there. And when they were out during the off-season, apparently the Canton governor had uprooted this shrubbery, and this was seen as a horrendous insult to the British Crown, along with the fact that allegedly the governor had dinner in the factory quarter once with his back turned to the portrait of King William IV. Needless to say, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, and this generally gets diffused by essentially the threat that trade will stop. While the East India Company is still the dominant Canton merchant concern, this worked quite well because the East India Company has a lot of reasons to want trade to keep going, namely the fact that it's lost its monopoly over trade with India and is increasingly running at a loss. But in 1833, the company loses its monopoly over trade with China. Overnight, the entire company presence in the factories vanishes, and the country traders like Jardine Matheson and Dent turn up in their place. Officially, they're supposed to be supervised by a guy known as the Superintendent of Trade. The trouble is, the Superintendent of Trade is a government official whose responsibilities are not clearly delineated. Moreover, the Superintendent of Trade is not sort of a career colleague of the merchants. He's someone else completely, and that means that there isn't this sort of sense of shared priorities. The first Superintendent of Trade, the Baron Napier, was quite an irascible man. Among other things, on his journey to China, he read Mccartney's reports, and he came to the same conclusion, that what China really needed was a swift kick to take down the entire structure of Manchu rule and put in its place a pro-British Chinese majority rule. He turns up in Canton in August of 1834 and is convinced by Jardine and Matheson, who are both fellow Scotsmen, that this plan is viable, and eventually goes up to Canton with an ultimatum in September. The Canton governor, Deng Ting-jun, sees this as completely nonsensical, refuses to abide by these demands, and what's worse, it turns out that the Chinese translators have rendered Napier's name, when literally translated, as laboriously vile. So Napier is utterly incensed at absolutely everything, returns to Macau, tries to argue for a war, and sends a letter back to Britain calling for one, and then dies of typhus. Even had Napier not died, the Duke of Wellington, who was Prime Minister at the time, completely shoots down the entire proposal, and in all of this comes to nothing. But the very scary thing is the fact that it could have. And I think this is why there is this argument for the contingency approach that says that opium was the particular incident in 1839 and not necessarily the fundamental issue, because Napier, although he's being influenced by Jardine and Matheson, isn't specifically pro-opium at all. He is going off instructions or proposals made by Lord Mccartney, who predates the ramping up of opium production in the 1820s by 2.5 decades. But, yeah, as I've alluded to constantly and we should get into, there is an immediate crisis in 1838. The major issue is that opium starts being discovered in the interior. In 1838, there is a stash found in the Forbidden City in Beijing, and the emperor does not like this at all, and begins ordering major crackdowns across the empire. What helps this, of course, is the fact that the legalization proposal was shot down in 1836. But the big thing is that the Spring Purification Circle leaps onto this and basically decides that this is the moment where they can start to reduce the laissez-faire attitude towards trade regulation in Canton and send their own man down to try and basically deal with the opium problem at its source. They send down Lin Zersu, who is this up-and-coming rising star in the Spring Purification Circle. And members of the circle generally advise Lin to treat this as a domestic issue. Basically, go into Canton, find out who is the sort of Chinese end of smuggling, and also to launch massive rehabilitation programs for smokers. Lin doesn't fully heed this advice. He does, find Chinese merchants involved in opium. He does target internal distribution networks. He does set up rehabilitation programs, but also he goes after the foreign merchants, which everyone says is a bad idea. Lin does what's known as the factory siege in later accounts. He basically evicts all the Chinese dock workers from the factory quarter. He brings in a group of basically private security contractors to surround the entire factory day and night and basically starve the British merchants into submission, demanding that they hand over all of their opium. While this gets sensationalized later on, the reality of the situation was that most of these private security contractors were being hired from the merchant houses, who, of course, were not willing to antagonize their British partners. And so food was being smuggled in endlessly. One merchant later described the major problem of the siege as being too much food and too little exercise because everyone was stuck indoors. But while the merchants are relatively nonchalant about all of this, the new superintendent of trade, Charles Elliot, is not. Elliot genuinely believes that Lin is going to kill the merchants if they don't comply, and he declares that the crown is going to pay for all the confiscated opium by confiscating it himself first. And he then hands the opium over to Lin. So he confiscates about 20,300 chests, which is apparently the amount of opium that is being held in the major sort of island holding stations like Lintin. As it turns out, he's actually overestimated the amount of opium. He needs to send one of the merchants back to India to buy more opium in order to confiscate it to hand over to the Chinese for destruction. But all of that aside, the key thing is, he promises that the British Crown is going to compensate all the merchants, and that's a roughly £2 million bill. And he sends to Lord Palmerston, who is the Foreign Secretary at this time, news of what's happened, the fact that he has promised 2 million to the merchants, and that war may be necessary. Privately, though, it's plausible that Elliot thought that if the opium merchants got compensated, this, by recouping their financial losses, and also with the recent shock reminding them of the consequences of smuggling, that potentially in the long term, opium smuggling could be curtailed, because now the merchants had basically the startup capital to go back into more legitimate trades like textiles.
Was his hope that the British Crown would pay for the confiscated opium a realistic one? Was there any sort of precedent for this sort of behavior?
There was precedent, because Elliot had been previously posted in Guyana, where he oversaw the abolition of slavery. The thing about the abolition of slavery that sometimes gets forgotten is that basically what the British government did was the equivalent of buying out all of the slaves. It had to basically pay existing slaveholders to give up their slaves. So Elliot must have presumably thought that the same thing was going to happen with the opium merchants. The problem was that the Whig government of 1839 was very, very vulnerable because Lord Melbourne had stayed in power almost entirely at the whim of Queen Victoria, despite the fact that even he had wanted to resign because his position was so precarious. And having to suddenly foot a 2 million bill to a bunch of drug smugglers was not exactly what the Whig government wanted. And so, at a secret meeting at Windsor Castle, when news arrived in October 1839, it was basically agreed that Britain would go to war with China, that the Whig government would spin it as basically being a matter of national honour, and that they were going to assemble a fleet in secret and finally tell Parliament when it was too late to stop.
You mentioned Windsor Castle. What was the input of the British monarchy in all of this? Were they in with the merchants?
Surprisingly, there doesn't seem to have been one. One of the things that I didn't mention was that Commissioner Lin actually wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria asking, opium is illegal in your country, why are you exporting it here? It turns out he was wrong. Opium was not illegal in Britain. In fact, people were drinking opium solution like mad. But it's often taken as this sort of moral call to Britain. I suppose to digress for a bit, if you read it in line with older Qing proclamations, it does come across like Lin genuinely believes not that it's a moral outrage that Britain should be doing this and we're appealing to Britain's humanity. It comes off as a threat because Lin is saying, our exports of tea and rhubarb are fundamental to Britain, partly because, in line with common Chinese medical thinking at the time, he believed that foreign diets inevitably cause constipation, and so you needed a natural laxative like rhubarb in order not to die. But anyway, he believed that China had the power of life and death over small trading powers like Britain. So his letter is actually a threat. Victoria never seems to have read it or given a response to it. So it seems that the British monarchy is just not particularly involved in these proceedings at all.
That leads to another follow-up question then. You've mentioned several times that, and talking about how this letter was more or less a threat, how did the Qing conceive of themselves, or even just the traders of the Qing, how did they think about the British? Because when we talk about the British in Western history, they're the omnipresent quasi boogeymen, depending on where you are in the world, always showing up. Did the Chinese have an understanding? I mean, obviously they had these extensive relations, so they must have known that Britain was not. They weren't the same as an unruly merchant group. Because how aware they were the Qing of the British ability to project power into Asia to essentially prosecute the war that came to be. Were the Qing aware of this? Were they surprised by this? Or did they just think that they could overcome it because of their own situation?
Yeah. This is a complicated thing because I think one important little statistic to throw in now: Beijing is 1,927 kilometers away from Canton. And this difference in scale, I think, is quite important because southern Chinese scholars are very aware that Britain is an incredibly powerful country. They don't necessarily know exactly where it is relative to China because, of course, there are vast distances, including the continent of Africa, in the way if you're trying to go by sea. But there are Chinese people who have travelled to Britain and back, who have written travelogues that get published in Canton. But the thing is that these probably aren't getting read in Beijing. So there are people in southern China who do know about British military capabilities and, for example, give Lin Zexu warnings about why you shouldn't antagonize them. But that same awareness does not exist at the capital. So, in fact, in 1841, the Daoguang Emperor asks what you'd think would be a very obvious question to ask earlier, which is, where actually is Britain? And it's not even necessarily clear that he will get a straight answer, because until recently, it was assumed that Britain was actually potentially a state in India, because that's where British activity was. And the Daoguang Emperor was also getting contradictory information that said that Britain was actually far off in the west, and asked, so why are Indian troops fighting for the British? So the amount of Qing knowledge about Britain is very, very weak, because, simply put, they're not reading the important sources of information that are coming out of the places where there is interaction with Britain.
Right, and then let's flip the situation around. You mentioned how there was essentially this conspiracy to start this war before Parliament could become aware of it. How aware of Britain? We have these embassy reports that you mentioned where there was this theory that the Manchus would be essentially toppled and replaced with a more British-friendly Chinese regime. We've mentioned these embassies and how they came to this conclusion, but were the British in a better situation when it came to knowledge of China, or of Qing?
It's a sort of a yes and no situation. As with Qing, there are sources of expertise on China on hand, potentially, but they're not always listened to. So George Staunton, who had been the main East India Company merchant until in fact the Amherst mission, he eventually gets elected to the Commons and becomes sort of the main China expert. But he is really only called on twice. The first time is to protest the overthrow of the East India Company monopoly, which is unsuccessful. The second time is to speak in support of the war in April 1840. So it's clear that the experts are on tap, potentially. But to what extent does Britain know about China beyond the coast? You can argue possibly not much. The awareness of developments in the deep interior aren't necessarily particularly strong. So, for example, the British don't even know for sure that the Taiping Rebellion is going on until about a year and a half later. So that indicates, and the Taiping Rebellion starts in sort of just inland from the coast of Guangxi. So I think that is illustrative of the extent to which British knowledge is confined to as far as ships can travel and the occasional embassy report. And in the event, the idea of a British initiated revolt is a pipe dream. So in that regard, the British are quite wrong. But, on the other hand, the aspect that is, actually, you don't need that many ships and troops to win a war of limited concessions against China does prove to be true.
Well, thank you. And with that, I think we are at a natural stopping point for the first part of our discussion. I hope that you join us next time for our discussion of the Opium Wars themselves and their impact on China in the 19th, 20th, and even into the 21st centuries.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.